The year was 1996, and Sarah Ferguson sat in the VIP suite at Miami International Airport, oblivious to the fact that her world was about to shatter. What began as a routine transatlantic telephone call with her husband, Prince Andrew, would end with one of the most bizarre displays of emotional distress ever witnessed in a first-class airplane cabin. "It's over, Sarah." Andrew's voice crackled through the receiver, distant in more ways than one. "A decision has been made to end the marriage." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on her. A decision had been made. Not his decision. Not their decision. Someone else, likely the palace, likely the Queen herself, had decreed that the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of York was finished. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the phone, her knuckles white against the beige plastic. The fluorescent lights of the VIP lounge suddenly seemed too bright, the air too thin. "What do you mean, not your decision?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. But the damage was done. The words hung in the air between Miami and Windsor like an executioner's axe, and there was nothing more to say. When Sarah boarded her flight back to England shortly after, she was no longer the Duchess of York in anything but title. She was a woman unmoored, adrift in a sea of her own making. What happened next would become the stuff of royal legend, whispered about in palace corridors and documented by Dr. Alan Starkey in his memoir Fergie, Her Secret Life. The Ferguson meltdown at 30,000 feet started quietly enough. Sarah took her seat in the first-class compartment, her face pale, her hands still shaking. The flight attendants noticed her distress but maintained their professional distance, as they were trained to do. But as the plane lifted off from Miami, climbing through the clouds toward the cold reality waiting across the Atlantic, something inside Sarah snapped. She began with the bread rolls. The first one sailed across the cabin with surprising velocity, startling a businessman reading the Financial Times. Then came another and another. Peanuts followed, the small packets becoming projectiles in her trembling hands. Fellow passengers watched in horrified fascination as the Duchess of York, wife to the Queen's second son, mother to two young princesses, came completely undone. But the piece de resistance was yet to come. Sarah reached for an airsickness bag from the seat pocket in front of her. With methodical precision that belied her emotional state, she took out a pen and carefully cut 2 eye holes into the paper bag. Then, in a gesture that would have been comical in any other context, she placed the bag over her head like a mask, and then she began making telephone noises. "Ring ring," she reportedly said, her voice muffled by the paper. "Ring ring. Hello? Is anyone there? Can anyone hear me?" It was a performance born of pure, unadulterated shock. A woman so traumatized by the cold, impersonal way her marriage had been terminated that she had regressed to something childlike, absurd, desperate. The telephone that had delivered her doom became a prop in her breakdown. The bag over her head was both mask and metaphor. She couldn't face the world, couldn't be seen, wanted to disappear. The depth of her shock was understandable. Despite the scandals that had plagued their marriage, despite the photographs with Steve Wyatt in Morocco, despite the toe-sucking incident with John Bryan that had made her a global laughingstock, Sarah had believed that her connection to Andrew was unbreakable. They had been friends before they were lovers, companions before they were spouses. Surely that counted for something. But she had underestimated the palace's capacity for cold calculation and the royal family's willingness to cut ties when someone became too much of a liability. The seeds of destruction had been planted years earlier, barely 3 years into their marriage. Sarah had been pregnant with Princess Eugenie when she met Steve Wyatt, the handsome Texan businessman who would become, according to some accounts, the love of her life. She had fallen hard and fast, swept away by his attentiveness at a time when Andrew's naval career kept him away from home for months on end. She met him at a time in her life when she was exceptionally low and felt Andrew wasn't supporting her. David Lee, co-author of The Duchess of York Uncensored, would later explain. Andrew may have been her best friend, and he probably still is now and probably always will be, but Steve Wyatt was the love of her life. The Morocco photographs had been embarrassing. Images of Wyatt cuddling Princess Beatrice in an almost fatherly way, of Sarah looking relaxed and happy in ways she never seemed with Andrew. But the palace might have weathered that storm. It was the John Bryan scandal that proved fatal. John Bryan, Wyatt's friend and cousin by marriage, had positioned himself as Sarah's business advisor, helping to maximize profits from her children's book Budgie the Helicopter. But their relationship had clearly crossed professional boundaries. When paparazzi photographs emerged of Brian sucking Sarah's toes poolside while her daughters played nearby, the public outcry was immediate and merciless. Sarah faced ridicule unlike anything the royal family had experienced in modern times. Prince Philip reportedly refused to be in the same room with her. Princess Margaret, ever the guardian of royal propriety, wrote her a scathing letter. "You have done more to bring shame on the family than could ever have been imagined." Yet through it all, Andrew had remained loyal, or perhaps simply ignorant. According to Dr. Starkey's memoir, the Duke continued to share a bedroom with his wife at Sunninghill Park, the Windsor home the Queen had given them as a wedding gift, even as Sarah conducted her affair with Brian under the same roof. When John Brian came to stay at Sunninghill, he and Sarah would indulge in sex acts in Andrew's study after the prince had gone to bed, Starkey claimed. The betrayal was both intimate and territorial, not just cuckolding her husband, but doing so in his own space, in a home gifted by his mother. Lord Charteris, the Queen's former private secretary, had reportedly been apoplectic. Vulgar, vulgar, vulgar. And now on that flight from Miami, all of it came crashing down on Sarah's head. The affairs, the scandals, the humiliation, the judgment. It had all led to this moment. A telephone call from her husband delivering news of a divorce he hadn't even decided on himself. She was being expelled, excommunicated, and she had no one to blame but herself. The other first-class passengers didn't know what to do. Some pretended not to notice, burying themselves in magazines and newspapers. Others stared openly, unable to look away from the spectacle. The flight attendants exchanged worried glances, uncertain whether to intervene or maintain a respectful distance. Eventually, the air sickness bag came off. The bread rolls and peanuts stopped flying. Sarah slumped in her seat, exhausted by her own outburst, and stared out the window at the dark Atlantic below. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the distance between who she had been, the vibrant red-haired woman who had captured a prince's heart, and who she would become in the aftermath of this divorce.
The years that followed would be complicated. Sarah and Andrew would separate officially, but never entirely, their connection proving more resilient than their marriage. They would eventually move back in together at Royal Lodge in Windsor in 2008, living as amicable exes, co-parenting their daughters, maintaining a relationship that baffled royal watchers and fueled endless speculation about remarriage. But that was still in the future. On that flight from Miami, with paper bag eye holes and bread roll ammunition scattered around her seat, Sarah Ferguson could only see the wreckage of her present. The telephone had rung with news of her divorce, and she had answered it with hysterics, with absurdity, with a breakdown at 30,000 feet. The IT was the most human response imaginable from a woman who had tried so hard to be royal and had failed so spectacularly. And in that failure, in that moment of complete emotional collapse, wearing an air sickness bag on her head and making telephone noises to no one in particular, Sarah Ferguson was more relatable than she had ever been as a duchess. The plane landed at Heathrow. Sarah disembarked, composed herself, and faced the cameras waiting outside. The divorce would be finalized. The scandals would continue. But she would survive, just as she always had, with resilience that was as much a part of her as the red hair and the mistakes. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to The Royal Insider.